So my name is Christian McHugh, and welcome to using SaltStack to Devops the enterprise. As you go through this, we can kind of hit at any level of technical or not technical, so just feel free to shout out some questions. I'll repeat them, and then we can go through whatever it is we want to talk about. So quick little intro slide. I'm some guy. I've been doing DevOpsy work for a while. I've been a sysadmin professionally since 1998 or so. And to me, all of this stuff is really the culmination of where we've been trying to go my entire career. This is really just doing computers right. I'm also the author of the SaltStack Jenkins plugin, and I mention that just in case anyone's tried to use it and you have any problems, now you know who to yell at. So find me at the conference or whatever. All right, so kind of what I wanted to go over a little bit is some enterprise stuff. And I mean enterprise really with like a capital E, like you run some legacy Java nonsense enterprise. And so we kind of have some big enterprisey kind of concerns, some big siloed kind of functionality. I want to go through kind of what problems we're talking about, articulate that whole argument, and then talk about tools a little bit. So enterprises. There's a bunch of small unicorn shops where they run an app, and then we hear the cool thing about how they're Dockerizing their app, and you can deploy your environments, and your environment is your environments, not environments. And so the enterprise concerns that I have to deal with are really the siloed operations of a whole lot of different people trying to do a whole lot of different stuff. I have a lot of management. I have maybe 4 different VPs that are over my operations that I have to talk to get anything changed. All of that to say, nothing moves very quickly. We're generally working in pretty conservative operations, and no one really wants to change things very fast. And so out of that, you end up not talking about technology as much as you talk about technology concepts. So for us, that means we talk about service management. I'm not talking about our website or our SAP CRM layers or anything like that. We just talk about services generally. And so out of that, just a couple of terms I want to go over of just, we're talking about services here. I'm not talking about an individual VM. I'm not talking about an individual OS. I'm talking about all of the bits and pieces that go into making that service so we can orchestrate the entirety of a service. And with that, we end up with really other cool concepts like service level agreements, where we can tie business process to what happens with that service. How much do we charge for those services? How much do those services cost us to run? And how much can other people charge, or how much do we charge internally with the OLAs? And so with that, we also end up with some stuff like our configuration management database is a really big deal. So small shop, you might not care a whole lot, and I care very much because that's my bread and butter of, if it's not in the CMDB and our single source of truth, then it might as well not exist. We can't do chargebacks on it, and the business won't talk to us about it. So enterprisey stuff, all of this kind of just comes back to the foundation of ITIL and what the culmination of what all those efforts were supposed to be. So let's kick it off with a demo, sure. So I just want to talk about doing some salt deployments and hitting some load on something and some patching operations and what we do for reporting. So just kick it off. Since I've done some of this stuff before, I'm not going to waste your time typing on the keyboard, so let's watch a little video. So in here, we're just kicking off a state orchestrate. This probably is not a shock to anyone. So all we're trying to do here is, we could try. So what you're not seeing on the screen right now is a command line of running a state.orchestrate. Not that big of a deal generally. I'm sure everyone in this room by this point has probably seen this a million times. And so what we're talking about here is we're kicking off an operating environment. And so, like I said earlier, I'm not worried about an individual machine. I'm worried about groups of machines. So cool, Salt does that thing for me. We've salted something. So then we open up a web browser, we kick over to our load balancer, we notice, great, we have some backend in there. So not only did we build up a web server and a load balancer and a database node, but we've managed to implement all of those things. So cool, there's some web app. So all of that to say, I'm not interested in talking about a single machine. I'm talking about a group of machines. Those group of machines all roll up into like my enterprise load balancer. In this case, it's just HA proxy. And in that way, we can kind of orchestrate what happens in the entirety of that service. So great, we have a service. All right, so let's talk about scaling that a little bit. Whoop, that went weird. Hold on. All right. So now, let's talk about what it means to scale that. In this case, I'm running off an Apache benchmark command just to put load on my web servers. So in here we can look at our HA proxy backends. We can see that those machines are indeed under some amount of high load for whatever our definition of high load is going to be. And then based on some monitoring scripts or salt beacons, we can then determine that we are under a high load condition, and we can send an event to the salt bus, which will cause our salt master to take a corrective action. Let's say it reacts and we use a reactor, and we will spin up a new VM. That new VM will then get deployed with salts and do all the same stuff we expect any salt environment to do, in which case we add a new web server, and then we add that new web server into our load balancer environment. Again, not all that crazy and new, but you can see that because we were under load, we've now auto-scaled that environment, and great, we've now successfully salted that thing. So mission accomplished, that's pretty good. So great, Salt can help us with our scaling issues. And then we also have the patching that I mentioned previously. And so with that web environment, we somehow need to worry about how we're going to do our patching operations. So again, we can do a Salt operation. We can pass some pillar data to a Salt orchestrate job. And because we are managing the entirety of the service with Salt, we can do that relatively sanely. In this case, that means that we can take a single web server out of our load balanced group, patch it, perform those operations, verify that it came back okay, and then add it back to our group. So that's what we just saw with HA proxy there. And then finally, we have these issues of reporting that I mentioned. So in our operations, we have a PCI environment, we have SOX compliance issues, we have government regulation. I work for an energy company, by the way. And so there's a lot of regulation, a whole lot of laws. We end up with auditors coming through pretty regularly to do stuff. And so reporting for us is also kind of a big deal and a pretty big expense point. We have teams of tens of people whose job it is that every time an auditor comes in that they have to reach out and touch our environments, and they run a bunch of computer stuff to get some computer metrics back that they then paste into Excel spreadsheets and hand those things off to the auditors. And all that obviously is kind of expensive because we have a lot of humans typing on keyboards. And so with Salt, for example, we could just write a quick Salt module and come up with some data. And that data is interesting because it's just computer data. There's no reason a human needs to be involved to generate this. We're asking for IP addresses and who's allowed to log into machines and what ports are open on the network and some just computer data. And so great, Salt can pull that all for us as well. So out of my requirements list, we've orchestrated our service, and we've kind of scaled and load balanced our service. We have operations for how we patch things, and cool, we can report it. So we're all done, right? Bam, solved all of our problems, no big deal. Well, what have we really done? That was a cool tech demo. And I started this off by saying that we had a lot of silos in my organization. So this is actually where my job starts. Picking a tool doesn't solve any of my problems. To do some of the stuff that I just talked about, I have to actually move that into deployments. I have to get past the provisioning stage of allocating money to be able to implement a tool. And I'll have to talk to a lot of people. I have to get buy-in. I have to get all the siloed operations to work as one unit. And that's really, really hard. I was talking to some folks over the last couple of days and mentioned a lot of people, process, and technology. I don't have technology problems. Technology problems, we have known good ways of running things. We have known good ways of scaling things. So everything else is kind of difficult. So for me, there's a lot of different teams involved in those operations that I just pointed at. So in order to spin up that first VM, in order to do the orchestration job at the very beginning, we have a VM deployment team who is responsible for performing those. That also involves storage because we're going to touch some sand someplace in order to deploy a VM. And so I need the storage folks to get involved and then after they are done with their ticket, they'll pass it off to the VM deployment team, who then passes it off to one of two different operations teams, depending on which OS we're talking about, who then have to get networking involved because we just added a thing to the network. And then we have to get security involved because we just added a thing to the network. And then I have to get compliance involved for the same reasons. And then there's the app teams involved in making sure any of those applications work. And there's the dev teams involved to make the applications that get on that environment. And there's the architecture review board that has to be over all of that. We are not in full screen, so you're missing content. click the bunch. All right, so we have compliance folks, we have app team, we have dev teams, we have architecture review boards that we have to get everything processed through. We have a completely separate patching team from any of the rest of these. We have a completely different testing team who needs to be involved in this whole process. We have a help desk who for some reason are the people who are responsible for updating the CMDB in our environments. And then there's my team, who has nothing to do with any of the rest of these people. So how do we make any headway? Well, the most critical thing, first of all, is getting management buy-in. If your management's not serious about this, if they say, hey, we're going to make DevOps a thing, and then it's never funded, and they spin up some independent team, and you don't really get to talk to those other teams, it's going nowhere fast. So make sure you have management buy-in, otherwise they're not very serious. So generally, you have to do some sort of cost-benefit analysis to kind of relate to the business what it is that you're talking about. So as we roll out automation, what benefit does that automation have, and what case can be made for some of this automation? So a lot of those things are things like, well, what does it cost for people to do the work today? Let's, like I said, do some cost-benefit analysis. So if you're going to spin up a new project, how long do you spend waiting for that VM? How many people are involved in that process of making a VM on your network? And then how much does it cost for that to happen? What's the wait time that everyone sits around waiting for the 2 weeks at the beginning of a project lifecycle in order to kick anything off? How many employee hours are spent patching, for example? I just mentioned we had a separate patching team, and when Heartbleed came out, we spent 636 hours remediating Heartbleed. At the environment that I was at before, where we had previously rolled out Salt pretty widely, Heartbleed was a complete non-event. We came into work that day, the Heartbleed stuff got announced, we went to a quick emergency change management review board. The entire thing was done in under half an hour from announcements to patched environment. And new enterprisey big environment place, 636 hours. So the cost of all of your security responses, all of the compliance and auditing stuff. I mentioned that we had teams of 30-ish people who are responsible for doing compliance reports currently today. So all of these things are ways that we can kind of validate and inform our business as to why we should go through automation efforts, to figure out how much money we're spending on all these efforts, to figure out how much we should spend on proper automation. So we can also track tickets. So mostly you want to figure out where time is being spent, and that allows you to not only make a defense for your budget for any of these purposes, but also kind of gives you your priority list about what are the biggest pain points in your organization. And so out of that, you also have the cost to bring something down for maintenance. In our case, we have a customer-facing website. That's where people go to our company to sign up for service, to pay their bill, to communicate with us. Most of our users communicate with us via our website. If I take that website down for 4 hours every Friday, how much money am I losing? Maybe our customers don't care, maybe they care a lot. Large consumer websites, I don't know, Amazon can probably tell you exactly how much money they'll lose if Amazon.com is down for 5 minutes. And so their SLAs are based on saving that money. We also have to worry about the cost of duplication and tools. So Salt, pretty capable of doing a lot of things. I mentioned some of those reporting compliance things that we were able to do with Salt. So how much would we be able to save in unifying our environments with tool unification? And then if we ever want to do any cloud stuff, right now we are completely on our own server rooms. So we have teams of people that manage hardware. We have multiple teams, as I went through, that manage the server rooms and the OSs on them. Well, if I'm going to coordinate 200 different cats from four different vendor organizations in order to do a cloud operation, have them generate an AMI or something, that's not going to work. So really, all of this, Salt and DevOps and configuration management and everything that we talk about at these conferences, it's kind of a prerequisite for being able to do any sort of sane cloud deployment. And then we also have the overhead of our app deployments. Right now, we do 4 deploys a year on our website. So that website where we get users to sign up for our service and pay their bills, it's an ASPX website running on iOS. It's not that big of a deal. There's nothing that fancy behind it. We have it talking to SAP, which has an Oracle backend, but it's not that fancy. We do 4 deploys a year. of ASPX because of dealing with our siloed infrastructure is a lot of work. So when the business themselves say that they want to deploy faster, that's our business case to go to the rest of our IT organization to say that we need to do this stuff better and right. And that's a really big deal, because if the business comes to me and says, I need to get something out there faster, that's why we exist. That is our differentiating value add. That's the reason our company exists. That's our income stream, where if a customer comes to us and they try to pay their bill on the website and the website's broken or janky that day and they have some problem and they get frustrated, all I can possibly do is annoy our customers. So I mentioned I work for an energy company. We sell power. It's a commodity. They can go somewhere else and get just as good power from anywhere else. So this is the differentiating value add, where if my website is slightly less crappy than my competitor's website, that's a reason why they might use my service. Otherwise, I don't have much going on. So all of this to say that this is what informs your tool availability, like what tools you should use, and kind of the priority queue about what it is you've got going on. How much of this can you afford, and how much of this do you tackle all at once? So to help you figure out what we should all tackle all at once, I like to do value stream maps and figure we'd go through one. So to take that example that we had earlier of trying to spin up a VM, let's do a value map of what it means to spin up a VM. So to start off, let's figure out what all the little buckets are that get us closer to the goal of having a VM. So we're going to first start with the request. Someone says, I need a new VM in my environment. Then we create a VM, let's say. We can build up that VM to be whatever it's supposed to be in our environment. And then we'll call it done. So that's pretty good. We could probably get into more detail there, but we'll just start somewhere. So with that, we can then start putting in some timelines. So, well, I can send off an email to our help desk to say, I want a VM, which is our official process today. The help desk will likely send me an Excel spreadsheet that I then fill out, and I send that back to them because we use Excel as a form. And then they will probably tell me that they sent the wrong Excel spreadsheet. I'm supposed to use the new form, and then I send that back to them. And so it takes me 5 minutes to a day to generally get through that process of requesting a VM. The VM itself, we use some cool VMware tools, so that takes us like an hour. It's not that big of a deal. That's not too bad anymore. We recently rolled out VRO and VRA, so that's all awesome. That used to take a couple of days. And our base build takes a little while. You know, we have those various teams who have to get onto a machine. They have to SSH or RDPN. They have to do some stuff and make the magic computer a computer, so that's cool. But then we also have to deal with, say, our networking team and how they do their firewall management. From the time that I request a firewall port to be opened, we have a 2-week waiting period for the SLA, and then they do the work. And then probably after I get that VM back and I try to log into it, I'm probably not able to because getting access to a VM is not the same thing as requesting a VM, so I then have to request access because I can't actually log in anything. They probably didn't have directory services, so there's some time there. That takes a little while. So then we also have to graph out how long you wait between each of these steps. So as I mentioned, we have a 2-week SLA between all these teams. So cool, that's unnecessary wait time. So let's add up some of those times in there, and then we'll come up with a big total here. And so this tells us that, cool, out of all of that, we're waiting for somewhere around 28 days. We spend about 23 to 29-ish days doing some amount of work. I mean, mostly waiting. We could micro-optimize what each of those things entails, for a total time of somewhere around 51 to 57 days to get a VM in my environment today. Whew. So if you asked anyone in my company how long it took to get a VM, they're going to tell me 1 hour. Because that's what we just did, right? We implemented that tool that one time. So done. But that's not what our actual experience is for anyone who actually needs to get work done. And so to ensure that everyone is on the same page about what it is that we're all talking about, that we're talking about the same vocabulary of what problem it is that we're trying to solve, it's useful to go through some of these exercises with folks. So if I ask my head of architecture, how long does it take to get a VM? He's going to tell me 1 hour. If I ask my CTO, how long does it take to get a VM? He's going to tell me 1 hour. Because how long does it take to get a VM isn't the proper question. It's how long does it take for the customer to get a VM? And that's something that we don't necessarily think about in our worlds. So by going through this exercise, it allows us to all talk about the same concept, and everyone's kind of on the same page as to what it is that we're trying to solve for. So I recommend value maps. They're useful. So that was a digression. All of this to say, I'm not going to fix all of that all at once. So we're not going to boil the ocean. Anyone have kids or ever managed people? So whatever works for one person probably doesn't work for all people. And organizations are the exact same way. And that's a useful thing to keep in mind. My organization isn't dumb. They're not a bunch of idiots that are trying to do this wrong. No one comes to work saying, I'm going to get in Christian's way today and make a VM take 50 days. Everyone's individually trying to micro-optimize their portion of the process. We don't necessarily have a holistic view of what the process entails. And so it's worth fighting the good fight effectively, but remembering that everyone's unique, and what works in one organization won't necessarily work everywhere, so that's kind of the problem that we're talking about. So all of our processes need to adapt to our real-world use cases. So we don't want to start with silo removal in these events. We want to just kind of ease the communication and the current workflows that we have, and I'll get into that in a little second. So in our environment, that might mean that we don't tell everyone, hey, you're doing it completely wrong. I'm going to automate your entire job with a shell script. That's probably more something to the effect of we can set up like a bunch of Git repos with GitFS in the back end and have each team get to manage their individual layer that they're currently managing today. I don't necessarily have to unify the entire stack all at once. Can kind of ease people into it. Yeah, so as it mentions there, we have enterprise architecture who's responsible for a whole lot of architecture things. I don't want to kick them out of the process. I just want to make them part of my process. So I mentioned that management engagement before, and Gartner had some words about that in case that holds any weight with this awesome crowd. So Gartner said that the most critical success factor to deploying DevOps and transitioning to a high-performing organization is changing the mindset from siloed operations to enabling continuous delivery. So all of that to say, siloed operations are real bad. And siloed operations won't change unless management says they're going to change. It's not going to be a handful of engineers in the company that change how the company works. It's going to have to come from the top. And so this is all a conversation around what it is that we're trying to accomplish, a la that value map from earlier, and then getting everyone kind of on the same page. So as we know, DevOps isn't just a project. You're not going to launch a DevOps initiative and have it be done. It's a culture of continuous improvement to some degree. It's everyone trying to make this whole thing better. So we also need to keep in mind how our business operates in talking business. So we need to keep kind of the scope of what we're talking about in mind. So you can tell a story of how what your recommendations will do to affect the business. So we could start off with something like, we're going to make patching better. That patching operation I showed earlier, like that was better. That wasn't a team of 200 people every week who get together and look through Excel documents and have to manually patch things. That was a little scripty thing that we ran, and that was better. But even better is if I can say something more akin to like, well, I'm going to reduce patching times by 90%. But even slightly better, if you have the data available, is that we're going to reduce patching hours from 330 to down to 3, resulting in $13,000 of monthly cost savings. Like, that's a thing that someone can get behind. And that's not necessarily a role that any of us think about, but in order to make DevOps a thing, sometimes it's worth figuring out what the business cares about. So when we communicate with management, we have to keep in mind what all the terminology differences are, and then figure out what's important to them and speak in terms that they understand, and figure out how these individuals all work. We're dealing with individual people in management, and they all have their individual work styles of communicating. They all have their individual care-abouts, so just keep that in mind. So everyone's kind of a unique individual. And for some folks, you might have to talk about fully managed services, and for other people, you talk about individual metric improvements. So all of this to say, just keep it in mind of who your audience is. And everyone's unique. So no one's particularly good or bad at doing any of this stuff. It's just whatever works for your organization is what it's kind of going to entail. So I mentioned the metric improvements there, and that's really key to making any of this stuff happen in a big enterprise environment. So whatever you need measure, that's what it takes to get improved. So you have some operational metrics you can worry about, and you have some service velocity metrics you can worry about, and there's some customer service and customer value metrics that you can track, and you have some business value metrics. I don't expect you to read any of that right now. It's just to say they exist, and you can look over slides later if you need to. So all of this you can kind of cut down into simple goals. So I mentioned a priority list earlier. So we can keep things somewhat simple and iterate on them. And as I was talking to some friends about these speeches, one of the important points that they mentioned is don't let egos take over. This isn't about like coming in as a DevOps architect and telling people how to run their operations. It has nothing to do with that. You're trying to solve some business problems. And so you don't want to let anyone's ego get out of control. And it's not about anyone being right or wrong. It's just trying to make the whole system better. So while simultaneously you don't want to just rush off and implement something crazy, you also don't want to spend forever arguing about the optimal way to implement that thing. So just kind of try to get agreement on what it is you're trying to accomplish and start somewhere and iterate on it. So we're probably all familiar with the minimum viable product examples of don't try to build perfect, just try to build something and iterate on it. All right, so that was a lot of stuff. Is that everything? Well, you need to make sure you have management buy-in. I'm not sure if I mentioned that one. It's a pretty big deal. This is all really about communication. So you need to get all the stakeholders into the same room whenever you kick off these initiatives. Those 18 teams, whatever it was I had earlier up on there on the board, they all need to be involved. DevOps isn't about dev and ops. It's about security and architecture and compliance and the one patching team you have that one time. Like all of those folks currently are involved in your operations and they all need to be involved in any kind of DevOps initiatives that you have. So all those teams from before. And most importantly, you need to ensure that management attends those meetings. So that probably means that you have your VP of whatever sitting in the room when you kick off some of these DevOps goals and talk about what it is you all are trying to accomplish. You can post your constant progress updates and reminders, so keep everyone involved constantly. Host brown bag sessions about what it is that you're talking about that day and what tasks you've selected for process improvements, kind of your high priority tasks. Make sure everyone's kind of involved and knows what's going on. That's really key because if you have a, say, 6-month-long project window for implementing the first round of configuration management in some test environment, and half your organization doesn't know about it anymore because they've forgotten about it because it's a 6-month-long crazy project, they're going to lose interest and everyone's going to forget that that's a thing and no one's going to care anymore. So you have to constantly post progress updates. And ensure you have sign-off on all those decisions. So personally, I'm a big fan of the Roman vote. So simply put, that's just whenever you have a meeting and everyone's deciding about what to do, you literally go around the room and ensure that everyone votes. And so that's a, yep, everything's good, I approve. That's a, I have nothing to say, I don't really care, I'll take the majority. And that's, we need to talk. So go around the room and ensure that you either have all thumbs up or all neutrals. Otherwise, you have a real problem. Because when those people leave the room, they're not going to be your advocate and they're not going to help you with any of the work. That's also really important because if management's in the room, you need them to visually see that, yes, everyone was on board at the time, such that if something doesn't happen later, you could say, well, I thought we were on the same page, everyone agreed, remember? And get some buy-in. All right, so brown bag sessions, one method of communicating. You kind of have your demos and progress reports. These are just the technological talks that you do over lunch or whatever. And that's also where you get to record low-hanging fruit. People will come to you and say, this is what we're working on, or these are the problems that we have, and you can maybe not have to deal with those right at the moment, but that's a thing that you can come back to, so those are all pain points in your organization, so great. And out of these meetings, you can determine your final goal of end state. So come up with some goal of what it is you're trying to implement and work to get there. So cool. You want to make sure that these things happen on a fairly quick sprint. So aim for quick wins. You want to make sure that everyone can see the results of the operations as they go through. And you're building towards that end goal, but you're trying to keep your deliverables pretty quick. So I'm also a big fan of keep putting white papers up all over the place to keep everyone kind of involved. This one happens to be from a website, Wall Skills. And so whatever it is that you guys are working on, if it's pushing out Git and more source code management, then put up little flyers about Git in the office to make sure everyone's kind of on board. If it's Salt stuff, here's the minimum viable product one, whatever. Just keep everyone kind of engaged and involved all the time. So I've spoken to you a lot about not technology and not a whole lot of Salt stuff. So we're here at the Salt conference. What does Salt have to do with any of this? Well, Salt is super modular. As I guess probably everyone's aware, it's a config management system. It's a remote execution engine, and having remote execution on something is ridiculously powerful and allows you to kind of start anywhere. We've used it as a continuous delivery pipeline. We've used it as part of our build process. We've also used it as config management. And one of the issues that I started with was trying to get it as a compliance checker. So kind of wherever you need to deploy, whatever your biggest pain point in your organization, Salt's probably able to help you out a little bit. So you can write modules in Salt to handle those pain points. That report that I ran at the very beginning, that's just a Salt module that executed on all of our minions and then gathered back some computer data and generated a CSV. That took a whopping 15 minutes-ish to write, having never done it before, and it wasn't that big of a deal. So once you have something in place, figure out whatever your pain point is, the problem you're trying to solve at the moment, figure out where it can be used, proselytize the event bus, because that's probably where you'll find some real value going forward. Once you get reactors and stuff involved, it gets really amazing. And so kind of all of this to say, I recommend pushing all this stuff out pretty slowly. So in the case of Salt, that's something to the effect of you can have Salt automate part of the process that happens today. In the case of that patching thing earlier, our goal wasn't to make the patching team no longer exist. I'm not going to say, let's fire 200 people tomorrow, because that's not going to go over super good at any level of the organization at any point, and doesn't make sense. So how about we start by helping out the patching team, and we'll saltify part of their process and make it a little bit better for them. So, and looking at something, we can use Salt to delegate out some of that capability, and I'll get into what that means right here. So let's look at that patching example from earlier. So we can develop a remote execution of what it means to patch something in our environment utilizing Salt. Then we can give that patching team themselves a button to kick it off. I don't need them to become Salt wizards overnight, and I don't need them to change around their process overnight. I'm just going to help out their process and give them the ability to execute their process slightly better than they did the other day. So in the case of Jenkins, that's probably something like this. Here's just a quick little screenshot from Jenkins. Over on the right-hand side, there's the build button, slightly cut off, whatever. But instead of changing how the patching team does their operations, how about I give them a button to help their operations? I'm harping on patching quite a lot, actually. The reason for that is that what I mentioned earlier about having 200 people on a telephone call every single week that have to go through an Excel spreadsheet of 200 lines to figure out what to patch that week, that's actually what we do in our operations. So patching is a pretty big deal for us. And what that means today is that whoever's responsible for a service, every week they have to get on a phone call, they have to down their service, notify everyone via phone call that the service is offline, and then patching team gets on to then perform patching operations. Well, if I can just delegate out that whole first part and not have to have service owners every week touch machines, I could just give the patching team a button to do the right thing. That would really help them out. So in the case of Jenkins, they'll get back some outputs sort of like this. So instead of having to wait for everyone to down their service, we can just say like, cool, I've iterated through and discovered what web servers or whatever in my environment. I've downed them as appropriate, and the patching team can get on with their way. So once you have something in place that allows you to figure out what that service entails, chances are that everything's not perfect already, and you'll have to go through one or more of these steps. So what makes up your service? You have to come up with your service level agreements. You have to come up with what your outage windows are going to be. You have to figure out what the cost of your outages are. And you have to develop some sort of service monitoring to wrangle all that in and keep it under control, and develop some tests to ensure that everything runs the way that you think it does. And at that point, you're probably capable of making it really good and implementing some sort of automatic patching. So unlike demo stuff that what I started with, there's a lot of steps between I want to automatically patch something and then actually being able to do it. So all of that to say, ensure that everyone is really serious. So get and keep management involved. Make sure all of the players are in the same room. So as I mentioned, we're not just DevOps, it's DevSec, Net, Comp, whatever, everybody in the same room. So you need to make sure you have your cross-functional teams there with some champions. You need people to care in your organization, and communicate constantly about all of the stuff necessary. What the end goal is, what training's necessary, all of the current status of things, what the pain points are. You can record those to be the low-hanging fruit that you work on later that would really help someone out. Determine the current costs, because that both determines your priority list, as well as kind of keeping these projects going and showing business value for what it is that you're working on. That helps determine your priority list. And then rock it. Like, you've got your priority list, go do it. And this is not just a one-time operation, it's a thing that you continuously do. So with that, remember that everyone's kind of unique. So what this process entails specifically in your organization is going to vary from organization to organization. And that's kind of okay. So that's what I've got. Are there any thoughts or questions or disagreements? Shoot.
So when earlier you said you need to get management buy-in, can you be more specific about who management or buy-in?
As high up as possible. So if you want to roll out DevOps on your team, then your team lead's probably pretty good. If you want to roll out DevOps organizational wide, it better be your CTO. Like it has to come from the very top.
I've seen companies where you go in and you're the new guy and you see that they're not really doing DevOps, but the CIO is convinced, the CEO,
Yep.
that they're doing the DevOps and they're doing the big datas and all of that
Yep.
stuff. And have you got any advice for anyone who moves into that environment about how you reconvince people that it's actually been BS for the last 12 months? And how we need to do it properly?
So that's the purpose of going through some of like those value map exercises and getting everyone in the same room. So if you end up with a handful of technology folks in the room, they might say, yeah, great, we've implemented VRO or whatever. It takes us an hour to push out a VM. And it's not until you have the bigger conversation of what's the business impact of what it is you're trying to accomplish there. IT exists not in a vacuum, but in order to further some sort of business goal, right? So you need to tie IT's operations to all those business goals. That's not easy, and that's actually like the job of upper management. That's literally why they exist, but it's not always done, and it's not always done in a way that's very obvious to everyone. So having those tough conversations where everyone's in the room, you talk about what you're trying to do, and you have like those value maps, that's the purpose of that exercise, is to ensure everyone's on the same page and everyone knows what you're talking about. So it's hard. That's the short answer.
How do you deal with when you have your Roman vote and everybody is all over the map on what they want to do?
So the goal is that you don't leave to do anything if anyone disagrees. So that means like I need to talk about it. And so you're probably not going to extend that meeting for another 2 hours or whatever, but you get everyone back. You're like, all right, well, we haven't gotten consensus. Let's come up for another meeting. We'll figure out how we can get consensus. So DevOps, really big topic. All the automation, orchestration stuff, really big. There's all kinds of different ways you can do it. So if it means starting with a smaller scope, that's probably okay. Just implement something to get it going somewhere. So like just lessen your scope slightly to get that buy-in agreement generally. On the off chance we didn't have a ton of questions, I also have a bunch of other stuff we could talk about if you want. Keep this going as long as you want. Just to kick it off really fast, the reason why we ended up using Salt in the last couple companies I worked with, we went through a full-off evaluation and bake-off of various vendors' tools and came to the conclusion that Salt was really simple, but kind of more importantly, our sysadmins that we had in those operations revolted when we gave them other alternatives. And they kind of just said, like, we're not Ruby programmers. That's lame that you want to make us all Ruby programmers now. We're not going to do it. And so Salt was an easier sell in those environments. And we've gotten a lot of use out of the messaging layer of Salt and being able to kick off further builds and do more than just configuration management because we have that messaging layer. But an awful lot of the success that we've had has been based off of compliance. So it's kind of like the weirdo secret backdoor to getting some of these initiatives started was it's really difficult to figure out what's in your environment if you're not already really good and have like a good config managed environment, right? And that's kind of like a really expensive thing to accomplish. And so Salt, by virtue of its remote execution, can help out with some of those compliance initiatives. You probably have some tool you need to run on all of your machines in order to figure out how compliant they are. Well, Salt can make that process suck a whole lot less. So implementing Salt for just that reason alone is what's actually kicked off some of our initiatives, in case that helps anyone. There's some other stuff that worked out really well. So I guess, any other questions? We have a whopping 9 minutes left. Shoot.
You mentioned that other parts of the organization were layering salt states on top of base. Can you talk a little bit about how that's working both organizationally and technically?
Sure. So we have a enterprise architecture group who's responsible for setting kind of the base layer of what should be on an OS in our environment. And so that enterprise architecture group, we got to rewrite effectively their rules about what makes an OS in Salt. So they're just a bunch of Salt states. Those layers they put into a Git repository. And so when other folks have to do something like sped up a web server or whatever, they layer on top of that. So the Enterprise architecture people get to operate in a vacuum with their own Git repo. Other folks get to operate in a vacuum with their own Git repo. That's not optimal. There's some complications. But in general, that's been reasonably successful. That allowed us to get started with these projects at all. The layered Git FS thing I'm kind of a fan of for that reason. It allows everyone to get something done. That help? Cool. Anything else? Sure.
So did you leverage Salt for knock?
That's an active project now, in fact. Software-defined networking is the new hotness. Everyone says they want it. You probably have like VP or CTO or somebody who goes out to lunch with some vendor and they come back saying it's the new greatness, and so they demand those kinds of things. Obviously, that's a really big deal and requires a massive, probably, infrastructure upgrade and all kinds of hardware to be purchased. And you probably already have networking people who had a roadmap that didn't necessarily align with. So that's an end goal. And it's one that we're working towards, but haven't done yet. We've started investigating that slightly with Salt Proxy, just to talk to our existing environments a little bit, to get something going. Some of the firewall rule stuff that I mentioned earlier, it takes us 2 weeks to just set firewall port openings, and it's not that big of a deal. So we're working on implementing Salt Proxy to help out with some of that, kind of on a smaller scale. And then once we can demonstrate value there and roll it out bigger. You guys good? That's it? We haven't gotten very technical at all. It's sweet.